Are you sure this is yours? The officer's voice dripped with mockery as he dangled the worn, blue backpack from one hand, swinging it just out of reach. The girl, no older than 15, stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear herself respond. Yes, it's mine. Please, give it back, she whispered, her voice breaking. Around her, students whispered, some laughing nervously, others staring in uncomfortable silence. The officer smirked, leaning down just enough to meet her tear-filled eyes. You don't look like someone who can afford what's inside here. Let me see what you've got, maybe I can teach you a little lesson about honesty. He opened the backpack with a dramatic flourish, yanking out a neatly organized binder, a tattered library book, and a small zippered pouch of pencils and pens. The girl flinched as he tossed her things onto the pavement like trash, one by one. Stop, she cried, finally stepping forward, but the officer blocked her with one hand, his expression darkening. Don't you dare raise your voice at me, little girl. I'm just doing my job. Someone called in a report, said there might be something suspicious here. I'm protecting everyone by checking. You should be thanking me. The crowd around them had grown larger. Whispers turned into murmurs, then into gasps as the officer pulled out her lunchbox, opening it like it held something dangerous. Oh, look at this. Peanut butter and jelly. Classic, he mocked, shaking his head as if disappointed. Let me guess, you stole the bread. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. The weight of dozens of staring eyes pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, not out of anger, but out of helplessness. She had never felt smaller in her life. Someone in the crowd finally spoke up, a timid voice that barely rose above the noise. She didn't do anything wrong. Leave her alone. But the officer ignored it, too caught up in his performance. You see, this is what happens when people don't respect authority, he announced loudly, addressing no one and everyone. You all need to learn that actions have consequences. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to gather her scattered belongings, but the officer put a boot on her notebook, pinning it to the ground. Not so fast. You'll get this back when I'm satisfied you're telling the truth. For all I know, this isn't even your stuff. The girl looked up at him, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. Why are you doing this to me? I didn't do anything. I'm just trying to go to class. His face twisted into a sneer. Because kids like you think you can get away with anything. Not today. By now, the whispers had turned into open outrage. A teacher stepped forward hesitantly, trying to mediate, but the officer waved them off. This doesn't concern you. Go back inside. But it wasn't just the teacher. People in the crowd were beginning to record on their phones. Parents arriving to pick up younger students stopped to watch, their expressions shifting from confusion to disgust. The girl's humiliation was no longer private, it was a spectacle. Yet, no one seemed able to stop it. When the officer finally stepped back, he left her backpack unzipped, her belongings still scattered across the ground. Next time, he said with a smirk, don't act so suspicious. You might avoid all this trouble. As he turned to leave, she crouched down to pick up her things, her hands shaking. She could hear the voices around her, some sympathetic, others indifferent. That was messed up, someone whispered. She didn't deserve that. But no one had stepped in soon enough. No one had been brave enough to stop it. The humiliation was unbearable, but it wasn't over. Not yet. A car door slammed nearby, and the crowd parted as a tall figure approached, radiating authority and calm anger. The officer didn't notice at first, too busy laughing with someone in the crowd who had nervously tried to placate him. But then, the figure spoke. The voice was low, steady, and carried an undeniable weight. Officer, it said, cutting through the noise like a knife. Do you mind explaining what you're doing with my daughter's belongings? The officer froze, his smirk faltering as he turned. His face paled when he saw who was standing before him. For the first time, the girl looked up, her tear-streaked face meeting her father's calm but furious gaze. Relief washed over her like a wave, but it was tinged with something else, something colder. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The officer stumbled over his words, trying to justify himself. "I was just performing my duty, sir. There was a report of suspicious activity, and suspicious activity," her father interrupted, his voice cutting through the officer's excuses. "And that warranted humiliating a young girl, confiscating her belongings, and treating her like a criminal? My daughter?" The officer's confidence was unraveling. The crowd was silent now, every phone still recording, every eye fixed on the scene unfolding. "I didn't realize," he began, but her father cut him off again. "No, you didn't realize. You didn't think. And now, you're going to answer for it." He stepped closer, his presence towering over the officer, who was visibly sweating now. "Because I will not let this go." The tension in the air was electric, the weight of the moment crushing. The officer looked around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The crowd, once passive, was now an audience to his unraveling. And as the girl stood there, watching her father confront the man who had humiliated her, a small spark of hope ignited in her chest. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. How will this confrontation end? What will happen when the tables turn, and the man who thought he held all the power finds himself under scrutiny? Stay until the end of this story, because justice isn't always swift, but it's always worth the wait. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To every black viewer watching, we see you, we hear you, and we support your fight for equality and justice. This channel is dedicated to sharing stories that challenge prejudice and inspire change. Thank you for being here with us. We hope you enjoy this powerful story of courage and justice. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our mission of storytelling with a purpose. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The air was heavy with the faint aroma of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of traffic. It was an early spring morning in a modest suburban neighborhood just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. The kind of place where neighbors waved politely but rarely knew each other's names. The sidewalks were clean, lined with carefully pruned bushes and cheerful flower beds. But beneath the surface of this picturesque scene, life was anything but perfect for everyone who lived there. Jada Morris adjusted the strap of her backpack as she made her way to school. At 15, she was the kind of teenager who blended into a crowd, not because she lacked presence, but because she had learned to keep her head down. Her curly hair was tied back into a ponytail, and her sneakers were a little scuffed from months of daily use. But Jada wore them with pride. They were a gift from her father, Malcolm Morris, a man she deeply admired and who worked tirelessly to provide for her. Malcolm wasn't just any father. He was a judge in the city's criminal court system, a position that came with its own set of challenges and expectations. At 6'2", with a commanding presence and a deep voice that carried authority, Malcolm was respected by his peers and feared by those who tried to bend the law. But at home, he was simply Dad. To Jada, he was the man who helped her with math homework after long days in court, who reminded her to never settle for less than she deserved, and who never let her forget the value of kindness and justice. Jada's mother, Angela, had passed away when she was only 8. It was a wound that never fully healed, but it had made the bond between Jada and Malcolm even stronger. They leaned on each other in quiet, unspoken ways, building a life that, while far from perfect, was filled with mutual respect and love. Jada was on her way to South Ridge High, a school known for its academic rigor and occasional bouts of controversy. Being one of the few black students in her grade, Jada had always felt a little out of place. It wasn't that her classmates were overtly cruel, most of the time, they ignored her, but there was an underlying tension that lingered in the hallways and classrooms. A misplaced comment here, an awkward silence there. It was the kind of racism that didn't scream but whispered, leaving her to second-guess herself at every turn. That morning, as Jada walked through the school gates, her mind was focused on the upcoming math quiz. She had spent hours preparing for it the night before, fueled by determination and a cup of cocoa her dad had made for her. She didn't notice the police cruiser parked near the front entrance or the figure leaning against it, arms crossed, scanning the students as they filed in. Officer Derek Hayes was a frequent presence at South Ridge High. At 38, with close-cropped hair and a sharp jawline, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. Derek had been with the local police department for over a decade, and while he presented himself as a protector of the community, his reputation among certain groups was less than favorable. He had a history of disproportionately targeting Black and Hispanic teenagers, often using his badge as a shield for behavior that bordered on harassment. Derek's reasons for being at the school that morning were as murky as his intentions often were. Officially, he was there to ensure student safety, a vague justification that allowed him to roam the campus as he pleased. Unofficially, he had a chip on his shoulder and a growing need to assert his authority wherever he could. As Jada made her way toward the main building, she barely noticed Derek's piercing gaze locking onto her. But he noticed her. Something about the way she carried herself, quiet but confident, careful but not afraid, rubbed him the wrong way. Derek had a habit of zeroing in on kids like Jada, kids who, in his mind, needed to be put in their place. Jada was halfway to the entrance when she heard his voice. "Hey, you. Stop right there." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Turning slowly, she saw him walking toward her, his boots heavy against the pavement. "Me?" she asked, her voice tentative. "You see anyone else around?" he shot back, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's in the bag?" Jada blinked, confused. "My school supplies. Books, notebooks, my lunch." Derek tilted his head, feigning curiosity. "Mind if I take a look?" "Just routine stuff, you understand." She hesitated, clutching the straps of her backpack tighter. "I haven't done anything wrong. Why do you need to look?" His smirk widened, turning into something more menacing. "Let me explain how this works, sweetheart. When I ask to see your bag, you show me your bag. Unless you've got something to hide." "I don't," Jada replied firmly, though her voice wavered. "It's just my school stuff." "Then it shouldn't be a problem, should it?" Before she could respond, he reached out and grabbed the backpack off her shoulder, ignoring her protests. "Hey! That's mine," she cried, trying to snatch it back, but Derek held it out of reach, his grin widening as if this were all a game to him. "Relax," he said, unzipping the bag and pulling out its contents one by one. A textbook. A pencil case. A sandwich wrapped in foil. "Wow, a real criminal mastermind," he quipped, holding up the sandwich for the growing crowd of students to see. Some laughed nervously, others watched in silence, their faces a mix of confusion and discomfort. Jada's cheeks burned with humiliation. "Give it back," she demanded, her voice breaking. "You have no right." "Don't tell me about rights," Derek interrupted, his tone sharp. "You want to walk around acting suspicious, you deal with the consequences." By now, a few teachers had noticed the commotion and were hurrying over, but Derek ignored them, focused entirely on Jada. "Next time, maybe think twice about how you carry yourself," he said, dropping her bag and its contents onto the pavement. Jada knelt down, tears stinging her eyes as she scrambled to gather her belongings. The crowd began to disperse as the bell rang, but the weight of their stares lingered, pressing down on her like a heavy fog. As she stood, clutching her crumpled backpack to her chest, she saw him watching her, his smirk still firmly in place. It was a look that said he had won, that she was powerless to stop him. But he didn't see the fire in her eyes, the spark of determination that began to grow beneath the humiliation. Derek Hayes might have had the upper hand that morning, but Jada wasn't about to let him walk away without consequences. Not this time. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was who Jada was and the man who was about to step into this fight. A man who believed in justice, no matter the cost. The hallways of South Ridge High buzzed with quiet murmurs as the bell rang for the next class. Jada kept her head low, her body moving on autopilot toward her locker. Her hands trembled as she tried to turn the combination lock, the scene from earlier replaying over and over in her mind. Derek Hayes' smug grin, the way he had mocked her in front of everyone, and the laughter from some of the bystanders, it was like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Hey," a voice cut through the fog of her thoughts. Jada turned to see her friend Mia standing a few feet away, concern etched across her face. "Are you okay? I heard about what happened." Jada forced a weak smile, shaking her head. "I'm fine. It's no big deal." "No big deal." Mia's voice rose slightly, drawing the attention of a few passing students. She lowered it again, stepping closer. "He had no right to do that to you. Everyone's talking about it. Some kids even posted videos online." The mention of videos made Jada's stomach twist. "Great," she muttered, shoving a book into her locker. "Just what I need. More people watching me get humiliated." "It's not your fault," Mia insisted. "That guy's a jerk, and people know it. He's done stuff like this before. Someone should do something about him." Jada sighed, slamming her locker shut. "And who's gonna do that, Mia? He's a cop. They don't care about what's right, they care about power. What am I supposed to do? Complain and hope someone listens? That's not how this works." Mia looked at her for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're not alone in this, you know. You have people who care about you." "Yeah," Jada said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know." But the truth was, she didn't feel that way. Not in that moment. She felt small, powerless, and tired of fighting battles she hadn't asked for. The rest of the day passed in a blur, her teachers' voices blending into a background hum she could barely process. By the time the final bell rang, all Jada wanted was to go home and forget the entire day had happened. When she walked through the front door of her house, the familiar scent of her dad's cooking greeted her. Malcolm stood in the kitchen, still dressed in his crisp white shirt and tie from work, stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He turned as he heard her enter, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Hey, kiddo. How was school?" For a moment, Jada considered brushing it off, giving him the usual, "fine," and retreating to her room. But something in his eyes, a mix of love and genuine concern, made her pause. She dropped her backpack by the door and walked into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. "It was a day," she said finally. Malcolm set the spoon down, crossing his arms as he leaned against the opposite counter. "Want to talk about it?" Jada hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There's this cop at school. He stopped me this morning, said I looked suspicious or something. Took my backpack and dumped all my stuff out in front of everyone." The smile vanished from Malcolm's face, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. "What do you mean, took your backpack? Did he give you a reason?" "He said it was routine or something," Jada replied, her voice tinged with frustration. "But it wasn't. He was just trying to embarrass me. And it worked." Malcolm's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "What's this officer's name?" "Derek Hayes," Jada said. "He's always hanging around the school. I don't know why, but I don't trust him." Malcolm nodded slowly, his mind already working. "I'm going to look into this. What he did is completely unacceptable." "Dad, don't," Jada said quickly, panic flashing in her eyes. "It'll just make things worse. He's not worth it." "He is if he's targeting you," Malcolm said firmly. "You don't deserve to be treated like that, Jada. No one does." The determination in his voice made her chest tighten. She knew her father meant well, but the thought of confronting Derek Hayes felt overwhelming. Still, a part of her felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, her dad could do something to make this right. Over the next few days, the tension in the Morris household grew palpable. Malcolm spent hours on the phone, calling colleagues, reviewing policies, and gathering information about Officer Hayes. Jada tried to stay out of it, focusing on her schoolwork and avoiding the whispers that still followed her in the hallways. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was brewing, something bigger than she could fully understand. One afternoon, as Jada sat at the kitchen table working on a history assignment, Malcolm walked in, holding a folder thick with papers. He placed it on the table with a heavy thud, his expression unreadable. "What's that?" Jada asked, glancing up from her notebook. "Everything I could find on Officer Hayes," Malcolm said. "Complaints, disciplinary reports, incidents swept under the rug. This guy has a history, Jada. And it's not pretty." Jada's heart sank. "What kind of history?" "Targeting students, particularly students of color," Malcolm said, his voice tight. "Using his authority to intimidate and humiliate. And somehow, he's managed to avoid any real consequences." Jada frowned, her stomach churning. "So what happens now?" "Now," Malcolm said, his tone resolute, "we take this to the people who can do something about it. But it's going to take time, and it's going to take courage." Jada looked at him, her mind swirling with emotions, fear, anger, hope. "Do you think it'll work? Do you think they'll listen?" "They'll have to," Malcolm said. "Because I'm not backing down. Not until justice is served." In the days that followed, Malcolm's investigation began to gain traction. He reached out to parents of other students who had been targeted by Hayes, gathering testimonies and evidence. Meanwhile, Jada found herself drawn into the fight in ways she hadn't expected. She spoke to her classmates, shared her story, and slowly began to feel the weight of her fear lifting. But Derek Hayes wasn't oblivious to what was happening. He could feel the shift in the air, the whispers growing louder, the eyes that lingered on him longer than usual. And while he didn't know the full extent of Malcolm's efforts, he knew enough to sense that his grip on power was slipping. One afternoon, as Jada walked to her locker, she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned to see Hayes standing there, his expression colder than she'd ever seen it. "Think you're smart, huh?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Stirring up trouble, getting your daddy involved. You think that's gonna end well for you?" Jada's heart raced, but she stood her ground, refusing to let him see her fear. "I just want what's right," she said, her voice steady. Hayes leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing. "Let me give you some advice, kid. People like me, we don't lose. And if you keep pushing, you're gonna find that out the hard way." Jada swallowed hard, her fists clenching at her sides. "We'll see." As he walked away, the tension in the air was suffocating. But Jada knew one thing for certain, the fight wasn't over. And what was coming next would change everything. The courtroom was quieter than usual that morning, the kind of silence that carried an air of anticipation. Rows of seats were filled with parents, students, teachers, and members of the community, all there for a hearing that had quickly become the talk of the town. Jada sat at the front, next to her father, Malcolm, who was meticulously organizing his notes and evidence. She looked around nervously, her heart pounding as the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by someone who thought they were untouchable. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got nothing to worry about," he said quietly. "We've done everything we can. The truth is on our side." Jada nodded, swallowing hard. She wanted to believe him, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Across the room, Derek Hayes sat with his lawyer, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in his uniform, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. If he felt any remorse or fear, it didn't show. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The proceedings began with formalities, but Jada barely heard them. Her focus was on Hayes, who occasionally glanced in her direction, his eyes cold and calculating. When Malcolm was called to present his case, the atmosphere shifted. All eyes were on him as he stood, his presence commanding respect. "Your Honor," Malcolm began, his voice steady and clear, "I am here not just as a judge or a lawyer, but as a father seeking justice for my daughter, Jada Morris. On the morning of March 14, Officer Derek Hayes, under the guise of performing his duties, humiliated and harassed my daughter without cause. Today, I will present evidence that this incident was not an isolated one, but part of a troubling pattern of behavior that must be addressed." As Malcolm spoke, Jada watched the jury members, noting their expressions of curiosity and concern. She felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they would understand. Maybe they would see Hayes for who he really was. The first piece of evidence was a video recorded by a student at the scene. It played on a screen for everyone to see, capturing the entire incident from start to finish. The room was silent except for the sound of Hayes's mocking voice echoing through the speakers. Jada clenched her fists as she relived the humiliation, but she forced herself to watch. This was her truth, and it needed to be seen. When the video ended, there were murmurs throughout the room. Malcolm let the noise die down before continuing. "This video speaks for itself. But it is not the only instance of Officer Hayes abusing his authority. I have here testimonies from 5 other students, all of whom described similar encounters with Officer Hayes. Each account details harassment, intimidation, and actions unbecoming of a law enforcement officer. One by one, witnesses were called to the stand. Parents and students shared their stories, their voices filled with anger and pain. A pattern emerged, painting Hayes as a man who wielded his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. Jada felt her confidence grow with each testimony. She wasn't alone. This wasn't just her fight. When it was time for Hayes to testify, the tension in the room reached its peak. He walked to the stand with a swagger that belied the seriousness of the situation. His lawyer began questioning him, allowing him to explain his actions. "I was doing my job," Hayes said, his tone defensive but controlled. "I received a report about suspicious activity, and I acted accordingly. I had no intention of humiliating anyone." Malcolm rose for cross-examination. His gaze was sharp, his questions precise. "Officer Hayes, can you explain why you felt the need to empty my daughter's backpack in front of a crowd of students instead of conducting a private inquiry?" Hayes hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. I believed it was the best course of action at the time." Malcolm pressed further. "And what, exactly, was suspicious about a 15-year-old girl walking to school with a backpack?" Hayes shifted in his seat, his frustration evident. "It's not about her specifically. I was following protocol." "Protocol," Malcolm repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. "Is it also protocol to target students of color disproportionately? Because the evidence suggests a troubling pattern in your actions." The room was silent as the words hung in the air. Hayes's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed Malcolm to continue. Hayes's face darkened, his frustration boiling over. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Hayes snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "Sitting up there, passing judgment, pretending you're perfect. You don't know what it's like to be out there, dealing with people who don't respect the law." Malcolm's expression remained calm, but his words cut like a blade. "What I know, Officer Hayes, is that the law is meant to protect, not to oppress. And when those entrusted to uphold it abuse their power, they undermine the very foundation of justice." Hayes clenched his fists, his facade crumbling under the weight of the moment. The jury watched intently, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. The climax came when Malcolm revealed a final piece of evidence, a report showing that Hayes had been disciplined multiple times for similar behavior but had been allowed to continue his duties without consequence. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of the revelations impossible to ignore. When the proceedings ended, the judge announced that the case would move forward for a full review. Hayes left the courtroom with his lawyer, his expression grim. Jada felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken a crucial step toward justice. As she walked out of the courthouse with her father, she looked up at him, her voice steady. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "It's a start, Jada. And sometimes, that's all you need to change everything." As the courthouse emptied, the chatter of voices filled the air, a mix of outrage, support, and disbelief. Jada stayed close to her father, her head high despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Malcolm placed a protective hand on her back as they navigated through the crowd of reporters and onlookers. "Mr. Morris. Do you believe Officer Hayes will face consequences?" a journalist called out, shoving a microphone toward him. Malcolm stopped, his face composed but firm. "This isn't about belief. It's about facts. The evidence speaks for itself. My daughter and every student at South Ridge High deserve to feel safe, and I will not rest until that's a reality." The camera shutters clicked furiously as Malcolm ushered Jada past the reporters. Once they reached the car, he opened the door for her. "You okay?" he asked softly. Jada hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Just, tired." He gave her a small smile. "I know. We're almost there." The drive home was quiet, the weight of the day settling over them. Jada stared out the window, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. She wanted to feel relief, but the memory of Hayes's cold stare lingered, a reminder that this wasn't over. When they arrived home, the familiar warmth of the house provided some comfort. Malcolm went straight to his study, leaving Jada to sit at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched homework. The next few days were a whirlwind. News of the case spread quickly, sparking heated debates across the community. Some rallied behind Jada and her father, calling for justice and reform. Others, fewer but louder, defended Hayes, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. Social media became a battleground, with videos of the courtroom exchange going viral. Jada found herself at the center of it all, a position she neither wanted nor felt prepared for. At school, some students approached her with words of encouragement, while others avoided her altogether. She caught snippets of conversations in the hallways. "She's so brave," one girl whispered. "Her dad's just using this to get attention," another muttered. Jada tried to ignore it, focusing on her classes and her friends, but the pressure was undeniable. Every step she took felt scrutinized, every word she spoke felt heavier than it should. Mia stayed by her side, a steady presence that Jada was grateful for. One afternoon, as Jada walked to her locker, she noticed a figure leaning against the wall nearby. Her heart sank when she realized it was Hayes. He was out of uniform, wearing a plain button-down shirt and slacks, but his presence was just as imposing. He looked up as she approached, his lips curling into a faint, humorless smile. "Afternoon, Jada," he said, his tone too casual. Jada stopped, her grip tightening on the strap of her backpack. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice firm despite the fear creeping into her chest. "Relax," he said, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here on official business. Just wanted to talk." "I don't have anything to say to you," she replied, turning to leave. "Hold on," he called after her, his voice hardening. "You think this is over? You think your dad's little show in court is going to take me down? You don't know how this works." Jada spun back around, anger flaring in her chest. "No, I don't. But I know you're scared. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here." For a moment, Hayes's mask slipped, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. But he recovered quickly, his smirk returning. "Scared? Of what? A spoiled kid with a daddy who thinks he can change the system?" I've seen your kind before. You'll make noise for a while, but in the end, nothing changes. Jada stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. Maybe not. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. Hayes stared at her, his smirk faltering. For the first time, Jada saw something behind his eyes, a hint of doubt, maybe even fear. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding as she felt his gaze burning into her back. When she told Malcolm about the encounter later that evening, his reaction was immediate. He approached you. At school. His voice was calm, but his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Yeah, Jada said. He didn't do anything, just tried to intimidate me. That's enough, Malcolm said, his jaw tightening. I'll make sure he's held accountable for this too. The following morning, Malcolm filed a formal complaint about Hayes's behavior, adding fuel to the growing fire. The police department launched an internal investigation, and the community's eyes turned toward their response. Protests began to form outside the school and the courthouse, demanding justice not only for Jada but for all the students who had suffered under Hayes's authority. As the pressure mounted, Hayes's once confident demeanor began to crack. At a disciplinary hearing held behind closed doors, he sat across from Malcolm and Jada, his lawyer at his side. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. You've made your point, Hayes muttered under his breath as they waited for the panel to deliberate. Malcolm glanced at him, his expression calm but unyielding. The point isn't mine to make. It's yours. What you've done has consequences, Derek. And you're finally going to face them. Hayes sneered, leaning back in his chair. You think you're a hero, don't you? But you're just like everyone else, playing the system when it suits you. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked Hayes directly in the eye. The difference, Derek, is that I'm using the system to protect people, not to hurt them. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Hayes looked away, his jaw tightening as the panel members returned to deliver their decision. When the hearing ended, the result was clear: Hayes would face suspension pending further investigation, his career hanging by a thread. As they left the building, Jada felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew the fight wasn't over. Outside, a group of protesters cheered as Jada and Malcolm emerged, their signs and chants a powerful reminder of the support behind them. Jada looked at her father, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. We did it, she said softly. Malcolm placed an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. We started it, he corrected. And we'll keep going until it's finished. Jada nodded, her resolve strengthening. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind of emotions and actions, each one more intense than the last. Jada felt like her world had shifted in ways she couldn't fully process yet. Hayes's suspension was a victory, but it wasn't the end, not for him, not for her, and certainly not for her father. There was still an underlying tension, a sense that the fight had opened a wound that wouldn't heal easily. Malcolm spent long hours on the phone and at meetings, working with other parents and community leaders to push for broader reforms in the local police department. The complaints against Hayes were just the beginning. The deeper they dug, the more patterns they found, patterns of unchecked authority and systemic bias that had allowed officers like Hayes to thrive. Jada, meanwhile, found herself in a strange position. At school, she was no longer invisible. Teachers looked at her with a mix of awkward admiration and guilt, as though they were silently apologizing for not stepping in sooner. Students approached her cautiously, some offering words of support, others fishing for gossip. Even Mia, her steadfast friend, seemed different, prouder of her, but also unsure how to navigate the new attention Jada was receiving. During lunch one day, Mia slid into the seat across from Jada with her tray, lowering her voice as she spoke. Have you seen the news? Jada shook her head, her appetite minimal despite the sandwich in front of her. No. Why? They're saying Hayes might be facing criminal charges, Mia said, her eyes wide. Apparently, there's evidence he's been hiding things, stuff way worse than what he did to you. Jada frowned, the weight of Mia's words sinking in. What kind of stuff? I don't know exactly, Mia admitted. But I heard my mom talking about it. Something about falsifying reports, maybe even tampering with evidence. The revelation left Jada reeling. It wasn't surprising, not after everything she'd learned about Hayes, but it was still a lot to take in. If it was true, it meant this fight was bigger than she'd realized, bigger than her or even her father. That evening, Jada sat in the living room while Malcolm went over paperwork at the dining table. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the television in the background. Jada hesitated before speaking, her voice cutting through the stillness. Dad? Malcolm looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. What's on your mind? I heard something at school, she began, her words careful. About Hayes. People are saying he might be charged with more serious stuff. Malcolm nodded, his face thoughtful. It's possible. We've uncovered some things during this process, things that suggest he's been operating outside the law for a long time. Do you think he'll go to jail? Jada asked, her voice quieter now. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his eyes meeting hers. It's hard to say. Cases like this are complicated. Even with all the evidence, there's always a chance he could get away with it. But we're doing everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. Jada looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. What if he doesn't? What if he just walks away? Malcolm stood and walked over to her, sitting beside her on the couch. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Jada, justice doesn't always come quickly or in the way we want. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for it. What you've done, what we've done, has already made a difference. People are paying attention now. That's how change starts. Jada nodded, his words comforting her even as the uncertainty lingered. She wanted to believe him, to trust that their efforts would lead to something meaningful. But a part of her couldn't shake the fear that Hayes would find a way to escape accountability, just as he had so many times before. The next day, Jada's fears were tested when a new development made headlines. A local news anchor reported that Hayes's attorney had filed a motion to dismiss the case, citing lack of evidence and claiming that Hayes had been unfairly targeted by a public smear campaign. The story spread quickly, igniting heated debates on social media and in the community. Jada couldn't help but feel a pang of anger and frustration. How can they say there's no evidence, she vented to Mia during a phone call that evening. We have videos, testimonies, what more do they need? It's not about what they need, Mia said with a sigh. It's about what they can spin. Hayes knows how to play the system. But so does your dad, right? He'll figure it out. Mia's words gave Jada a small sense of reassurance, but the uncertainty still weighed heavily on her. The following week was filled with tension as Malcolm prepared for the next hearing, gathering every piece of evidence he could to counter the motion to dismiss. The stakes were higher now, and Jada could see the toll it was taking on her father. Late one night, as she passed by his study on her way to bed, she noticed the light still on. Peeking inside, she saw him hunched over his desk, his tie loosened and his face lined with exhaustion. She hesitated before stepping in. "Dad," she said softly. "You should get some rest." Malcolm looked up, his expression softening when he saw her. "I will. Just need to finish this." Jada walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've done enough for tonight. It'll still be here tomorrow." He smiled, the warmth in his eyes belying the fatigue in his posture. "You're right. I'll call it a night soon." As Jada left the room, she couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for her father. He was fighting not just for her, but for everyone who had been hurt by people like Hayes. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew he wouldn't give up. The next hearing arrived quickly, the courtroom once again filled with spectators and tension. Hayes sat at the defendant's table, his expression carefully neutral. His lawyer argued passionately for the motion to dismiss, but Malcolm's counterarguments were even stronger, his words carrying the weight of truth and conviction. By the time the judge announced his decision, to deny the motion to dismiss, the room erupted into a mixture of cheers and murmurs. Hayes's face darkened, his confidence visibly shaken. It was a small victory, but a significant one. As Jada and Malcolm left the courthouse that day, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The fight was far from over, but they were making progress. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, justice was within reach. As Jada and Malcolm walked out of the courthouse, the cool breeze hit her face, a sharp contrast to the heated tension that had filled the room moments ago. For the first time in weeks, Jada felt a small but undeniable sense of relief. The motion to dismiss had been denied, and Hayes would have to face the weight of the evidence against him. Yet, as they made their way to the car, a lingering unease hung in the air. Malcolm was quiet as he unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. Jada hesitated before speaking, her voice tentative. "Do you think this changes anything?" Malcolm started the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. "It's a step," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "But we're far from the finish line." Jada leaned back in her seat, staring out the window as they drove through the city streets. The passing buildings blurred together, but her mind was sharp, turning over every detail, every fear. "What if he still gets away with it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm glanced at her, his expression softening. "He won't," he said firmly. "Because we won't let him." The conviction in his voice brought her a small measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to quell the storm inside her. She wanted to believe him, but Hayes's smirk, his defiance, haunted her. The way he carried himself in the courtroom, even as the walls closed in around him, was a reminder of just how deeply entrenched his confidence was, how much he believed he was untouchable. Back at home, the tension didn't ease. Jada went straight to her room, tossing her backpack onto the bed before sitting down at her desk. The hum of her phone broke the silence, a notification lighting up the screen. It was a message from Mia. "Mia, did you see the news? Hayes's lawyer is already planning their next move." Jada sighed, typing back quickly. "Jada, no surprise there. He's not going to give up easily. Mia, you shouldn't have to keep dealing with this. It's so unfair." Jada stared at the screen for a moment before responding. "Jada, it is. But I can't back down now. Not after everything we've done." Mia's response came quickly. "Mia, you're stronger than I could ever be. Just remember, you're not alone." Jada smiled faintly at the message, grateful for Mia's unwavering support. But as she set her phone down, her thoughts returned to Hayes and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Malcolm was in his study, going over the next steps in their case. The stack of papers on his desk seemed to grow larger every day, each one a piece of the puzzle he was determined to solve. As he sifted through the evidence, his phone buzzed. It was a call from an old colleague, someone who had been helping him navigate the complexities of the case. "Malcolm," the voice on the other end said, "I've been digging into Hayes's records like you asked. There's something you need to see." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "What is it?" "Internal reports, documents that were supposed to stay buried. Hayes has been falsifying incident reports for years, covering up his actions. And he wasn't working alone." The revelation hit Malcolm like a punch to the gut. "Who's involved?" "Other officers, maybe even someone higher up. I don't have all the details yet, but this isn't just about Hayes anymore. It's systemic." Malcolm's jaw tightened. He thanked his colleague and ended the call, his mind racing. If what he'd just learned was true, their fight was about to get even bigger, and even more dangerous. That evening, Malcolm sat Jada down at the kitchen table, his face serious. "I need to tell you something," he began. Jada looked at him, her stomach knotting. "What's wrong?" "This case, it's not just about Hayes," Malcolm said. "There's evidence that other officers may have been involved in covering up his actions. This goes deeper than we thought." Jada's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. "You mean, it's not just him?" Malcolm nodded. "That's what it looks like. And if it's true, it means we're not just fighting one man. We're fighting a system that's been protecting him." The weight of his words settled heavily over her. She had always known this fight was bigger than her, but hearing it put into perspective made it feel overwhelming. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "We keep going," Malcolm said firmly. "We expose the truth, no matter how deep it runs." The days that followed were a blur of meetings, calls, and late nights. Malcolm worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence, each new discovery painting a more damning picture of corruption within the department. Jada watched him with a mix of admiration and worry. She knew he was doing this for her, but she couldn't help feeling guilty for the toll it was taking on him. One afternoon, as she walked home from school, Jada noticed a police cruiser parked on the corner near her house. The sight of it made her uneasy, but she forced herself to keep walking. As she approached her driveway, the car pulled forward, stopping a few feet away. The window rolled down, and Hayes's face appeared. "Miss Morris," he said, his tone deceptively polite. Jada froze, her heart racing. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I just thought we should have a little chat," Hayes said, leaning against the window frame. "You and your father have been awfully busy lately." Jada's fists clenched at her sides. "We're doing what's right." Hayes's smile turned cold. "Right. But you should know, sometimes doing what's right comes with consequences. You might want to think about that." Before she could respond, he rolled up the window and drove off, leaving her standing there, her mind racing. She ran inside, slamming the door behind her. "Dad," she called, her voice shaking. Malcolm appeared from his study, concern etched across his face. "What's wrong?" Jada told him about the encounter, her words tumbling out in a rush. Malcolm's expression darkened as he listened, his hands clenching into fists. "He's trying to intimidate you," he said, his voice low but firm. "He knows he's losing, and this is his way of lashing out. What if he does something worse?" Jada asked, her fear spilling over. Malcolm placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "He won't. We won't let him." That night, as Jada lay in bed, she couldn't shake the memory of Hayes's face, the veiled threat in his words. But beneath her fear, there was a spark of determination, a fire that refused to be extinguished. No matter what Hayes did, no matter how hard he tried to scare her, she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with anticipation as the final day of the trial began. It wasn't just about Officer Derek Hayes anymore, the case had unraveled years of corruption that ran deep within the local police department. What started as one man's abuse of power had revealed a network of complicity, cover-ups, and injustice that could no longer be ignored. Jada sat next to her father at the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart raced, but she kept her head high. She had come too far, endured too much, to let fear overshadow what this day meant. Malcolm was beside her, calm and composed as always, though the determined set of his jaw betrayed the gravity of the moment. The prosecution laid out the final pieces of their case. Evidence of falsified reports, testimony from other officers who had come forward, and Derek Hayes' own actions painted a damning picture. Hayes sat at the defendant's table, his confident demeanor now replaced with a sullen, resentful expression. He avoided looking at Jada and Malcolm, his focus fixed on the desk in front of him. When it was time for the closing arguments, Malcolm stood, his presence commanding the room's attention. "This case is not just about one man's actions," he began, his voice steady and resolute. It is about accountability. About ensuring that those who are sworn to protect and serve are held to the highest standard. My daughter, Jada, has shown immense courage in coming forward, and today, we have an opportunity to make sure that her bravery, and the bravery of others like her, is not in vain. The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Jada felt a swell of pride and gratitude for her father. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for justice, for change, for a better future. When the judge finally read the verdict, the tension in the room was palpable. Derek Hayes was found guilty on multiple counts, including misconduct, falsification of records, and abuse of power. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of the decision sinking in for everyone present. Jada exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over her in waves. But the verdict was only part of the resolution. Over the following weeks, investigations into the police department continued, leading to the dismissal and prosecution of several other officers involved in the cover-ups. Policies were re-evaluated, reforms were implemented, and the community began to heal. For Jada, the journey didn't end with the trial. She became a voice for change, speaking at community events and schools about her experience. What had once been a source of pain became a source of strength, fueling her determination to ensure that no one else would have to endure what she had. One evening, as Jada and Malcolm sat on the porch, the setting sun casting a warm glow over their neighborhood, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked. "What we've done?" Malcolm looked at her, his eyes filled with pride. "It's a start," he said. "And that's how every change begins, with someone brave enough to take the first step." Jada nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace, not because everything was perfect, but because she had found her voice, her purpose, and the strength to keep moving forward. As for Derek Hayes, his life was forever changed. Stripped of his badge and sentenced to prison, he no longer held the power he had once wielded so carelessly. In the quiet of his cell, he was left to face the consequences of his actions and the choices that had led him there. Whether he felt remorse or not was unclear, but the world around him had moved on, leaving him to confront the reality of his downfall. For the community, the case became a turning point. The protests, the conversations, and the reforms sparked by Jada and Malcolm's fight created ripples of change that extended far beyond their town. It wasn't a perfect system, not yet, but it was a step towards something better. Now, as we reflect on this story, I want to leave you with a question: what does justice mean to you? Is it about punishment, accountability, or something deeper? Jada's story reminds us that real change often starts with the courage to speak up, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against us. Her journey teaches us that standing up for what's right is never easy, but it is always worth it. What would you have done in her place? How can we, as a community, ensure that stories like hers lead to lasting change? Share your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear from you. And if you found this story as inspiring and impactful as we did, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and move you. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join us on this journey of storytelling with purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.